This video is for chapter 13, which is entitled Future of the Family. So, the chapter starts off by noting that due to all the changes in the family, and some of those changes in family life, which the textbook has gone over, are, of course, the inequality between the rich and the poor is widening, the number of children born after the baby boom has declined, interracial marriage is more acceptable and common, gay and lesbian rights have advanced, and gender inequality in families has decreased globally. So, some of these are changes related explicitly to the family, and some of these are changes that, while not explicitly related to the family, certainly impact the family, its organization and, how folks live their day to day lives. So, with all these changes, some people have jumped to the conclusion that the family as an institution is doomed. And, obviously, it's just worth noting that Cohen does not agree with this kind of super pessimistic kind of view of the family institution. He doesn't think it's doomed. He doesn't think that, families are going obsolete. It is more that family and family life has changed. It's being transformed. And as we've learned, these changes to family life aren't new. Families have changed and have been transformed in terms of their structure, in terms of their roles before in the past. So we're just kind of living through this time period of transformation where some people are more or less accepting of those changes. And so we really haven't kind of restabilized yet. And so this chapter is a lot about those changes. What are they, what has contributed to them, and how people are responding. I have some articles that I have selected that I think are relevant to this chapter's themes. The first of those articles is just about what I just said, the changing face of the American family, and it comes from Parents. Which is a magazine slash website. And if you read this article, some questions to consider: what are some of the changes to the family the author focuses on? Does the author seem overall supportive or critical of these changes? What evidence does she offer to support her perspective? So, like previous chapters, we're going to be talking about kind of Cohen's main themes of diversity, inequality, and change. So, beginning with diversity. So, in this part of the textbook, the concept of social diversity is discussed, and this is basically the differences and experiences and characteristics of people in a population. And there's a little bit of discussion in the book about, does breaking ourselves into categories, is that divisive and does it lead to conflict? Or does recognizing and labeling difference is it liberating because it allows people to express their identity? And obviously, it's a little bit of both. It can be a little bit of both. There are both negatives and positives to emphasizing diversity within a population. But whether we emphasize it or not, it certainly exists. And how we can measure the level of diversity in a society is discussed through the concept of the diversity index. And a diversity index is a calculated number that gives us the probability of the difference between characteristics of two random people. And it kind of ranges from, perfect uh, perfect diversity where everyone is completely different, and perfect non-diversity where everyone is the same. And your book kind of talks about how the amount of diversity in our country has increased, and it's increased in regards to several different characteristics, but your book focuses on a couple. One of the things, of course, it focuses on is race and ethnicity. Racial ethnic diversity has increased in our society, and Cohen emphasizes, the role of immigration, and and in the growing racial ethnic populations in the U.S. from Latin America and Asia, and certainly is. It's not just important to emphasize the role of immigrants, just in terms of how they are increasing the racial diversity at this present time, but also because immigrants and the children of immigrants, many immigrants are young, they're healthy, and so they're going to be having children. And then oftentimes, due to differences in cultural values, they have higher rates of marriage and childbearing compared to native American non-immigrant Americans. And so they have higher fertility rates, which means they aren't just contributing to the current racial ethnic diversity, but likely they are going to be impacting future racial ethnic diversity in the country as well. And so, your textbook notes that the future of families and fertility rates is somewhat going to be dependent on government policies with regards to immigration. Just how immigrant friendly of a country we continue to be and remain to be, is going to impact some of our uh, uh, racial ethnic diversity um, uh, rates, as well as just our overall fertility rates as a whole. Another form of diversity that your textbooks discusses is religion, and they talk about the fact that religion is related to family because it can affect every stage of family life, in terms of both beliefs and ceremonies. But when looking at the rates of diversity and the shifts in religious preference between the 1970s and 2010, which, of course, at the time this textbook was written, that was our last available census data. The United States has become more religiously diverse in the past several decades, particularly for people who are interested in religion and religious studies. The increasing number of people who indicate none for their religious preference. So the growing number of non-religious people in this country, is has dramatically uh, increased, comparative to previous decades. Um, the final type of diversity that your textbook discusses, and perhaps the type that is most obviously related to the course, is the diversity in family paths and types. So um, your book notes that the end of the 1950s marked a time of transition for family types and paths. And that's because in the 1950s, the great majority of heterosexual Americans married early, lived in, nuclear families, and then had more children relative to today's standards. And today, it's not that people don't still do these things, but they are not as common. In 1960, two-thirds of all households were comprised of a heterosexual married couple and their children. But in 2018, that family arrangement accounted for less than 45%. And that's because household types now include not just married couples, but more extended households, or multi-generational households, more people that are living alone, so individual households. Of course, as discussed in previous chapters, an increase in single parents. And then, of course, particularly for people that live in urban areas with the cost of living exceeding, the standard wage in a lot of areas. That means that people who are older are even relying on roommates and what we call um, non-family group households. So there is just a lot more diversity in family types, and even the pathways that people take to family types. So even for people who are part of that heterosexual married couple that was very normative in the 1960s. People are taking longer to get there, or they're having less children, or they're getting divorced and getting remarried, which is all just different paths. So we just have a lot more diversity in terms of family types and paths. um, but then, of course, there is inequality between those different family types, which brings us to that second theme of the textbook. So the rise of economic inequality in the last 50 years, Cohen notes, is one of the most significant social developments we face. There's a bigger gap between rich and poor families than what we had 50 years ago. And the middle class experiences more insecurity because, they kind of are aware that they are more likely to fall and experience downward mobility than they are to experience upward mobility and rise in the social class ranks. And so Cohen describes four types of inequality that pose significant challenges for individuals and their families: between family inequality, within family inequality, generational, from generation to generation inequality, and people who have no family inequality. And so let's talk about each of those separately. So between families, so comparing between families, Cohen notes that what definitely seems to be a consequential factor is education. There are more families with two high earners and more families with one low earner. And that is because college graduates are more likely to get married, marry other graduates, and then stay married. And then college educated wives are more likely to be employed than in the past. So what happens is now you have families where you kind of have this concentrated educational as well as economic advantage. At the other end of the spectrum, people with less education are less likely to get married. But then if they do get married, they're also more likely to get divorced. So they're less likely to stay married. People with less education also tend to have more children. And so this also contributes to the disparity between these two different family types, or the inequality between these two different family types, because a high income two parent family then has more resources to devote to each individual child, because they're also having less children. And you can kind of see the graph there, that is looking at the annual income of these different family types. And you can see that single mothers consistently have lower annual incomes when compared to even single fathers. And that married couples have more. But then you also can see, if you look at the slope of the line, that between 1970s and 2018, the married couples also, their average income has also increased. And like I said, this could be related to both, in some cases a greater return on education, but then also, in a lot of cases, the fact uh, that more of these married families are comprised of two college educated individuals, both of whom choose to work. Another kind of inequality we see between families is, looking at health. Um, there are three health advantages of married people, and Cohen says healthier people are more likely to get married. Marriage leads people to alter behavior to make them healthier, and then married people take care of each other, which means that you have a helpmate, someone also looking after your health. And so, if you're in a married family, and this is particularly true for men, there's some pretty interesting statistics that suggest that, if you're a man and you're married, you on average add to your life 5 to 7 years compared to men who are single. And so this becomes another inequality. Yet another inequality between families has to do with time. Individuals with many family members can combine resources and divide tasks. And so, so if you're thinking about it in terms of a married couple, or even a non-married couple but who share a household, because they can combine resources and divide tasks, this can free up time for employment or spending more time with children. On the opposite, time poverty is when people have insufficient time for rest and leisure after doing all the necessary work for one's family. And although time poverty can be an issue in all family types, clearly it's a large issue, particularly for people who have, are living in single parent families. And so, especially if you're a single mother who has a large family, particularly of younger children, those women are most susceptible to time poverty. And then the final kind of thing that inequality that the book discusses in regards to between families is just the level of social acceptance. There are still stigmas that exist around certain family types, particularly single parents and same-sex parents. And the flip side of stigma and the denial of rewards of acceptance is the rewards that are associated with having an acceptable or widely admired family structure. And so, that is that heterosexual married couple with children. And your book talks about some research that suggests, that suggests that this is true. For instance, the positive perceptions of married men in the workplace. They're seen as being more serious, more responsible, even when compared to, men who aren't married. So, moving on to inequality that can exist within families. And, Cohen notes that inequality within families is decreasing. Not that it's gone away, but it's lower than what it was 50 years ago. Why is that? Well, that's because for women who work, income has increased for women compared to half a century ago. And husband and wives are sharing housework and childcare responsibilities more equally than the past. Just because they're not equal doesn't mean, that they aren't an improvement over past uh, 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 shared responsibilities. And then preferential treatment of sons over daughters has decreased, once again, comparative to the past. That doesn't mean, of course, that everything within families is completely equitable, and family equality is still a concern. Men do till men do still tend to have higher incomes, and work longer hours at paid work, while women have lower earning power than men, and career opportunities are still more limited. And additionally, women still tend to do the larger share of housework and childcare. And so, this is significant, not just because of the impacts it has on individual families, how they balance their time and resources, how these types of unequitable sharing patterns can contribute to conflict and and potentially result in divorce. But it also is important for kind of larger social institutions, which Cohen's going to come back to in this chapter, particularly the balance, or lack of balance that exists between the work institution and the family institution. Moving on to the third type of inequality, which is from generation to generation. Um, Before modern capitalism, back when we were still in a more agrarian society, families used to be more limited in social class mobility, particularly if you lived in a society that had an estate system where, there was titles, landed gentry. But then after industrialization and capitalism, there was this period of time where social class mobility was created, and particularly during the United States. There was a time period where there was a lot of growth, as people moved out of the working poor, working class into the lower middle, upper middle class. But in more recent times, this mobility has diminished. Um, after the 1970s, the chance for social mobility began to decrease. And so, although the United States, Cohen notes, still clings to this myth about the American dream and the Protestant work ethic, it now has lower levels of social mobility when comparable to other developed countries, right? So, we still compare ourselves favorably to other countries as if there is a lot of room for economic mobility here. But it's worth noting, especially if the countries we compare ourselves to are the other developed nations as opposed to developing nations. There's less mobility here than those nations, and there's less mobility here than what we had 50 years ago. And so, in this way, family class status and background still have an important influence. US children are more likely to end up in the same social class position as their parents. Um, and, this is compared to other advanced democratic countries where children tend to move beyond their social class positions. So, if anything, our class system in the United States has become more entrenched. And you can kind of see that looking at the graph, like the number of children at the top quintile, and the children particularly at the bottom quintile, who pretty much remain, in the same quintile that they were born into. The final type of inequality is looking at, what about people who don't have families, because most of the data in this text is about families and individuals within families, but there are individuals without families. And your book notes that, understanding, orphans and adoptive children who haven't been, fully adopted yet, foster children. This complicates our assumption that everyone is part of a family structure. And Cohen notes that social policies are often created presuming that people are part of a family to help them. But more consideration needs to be taken into account that, there are people, young people in particular, who do live in these non-family arrangements, and that a future challenge in our country is going to be, how do we care for those without families, to help them? And so, an article that I have that kind of addresses this concern, is about what happens when you age out of a foster care, uh, particularly during a pandemic. And so it was from, the magazine The Nation. And I like this article because it describes the normal process of aging out the system, which was already not perfect, and presented real challenges. But then it discusses how the pandemic complicated that, and how some states at least tried to counteract it. But the fact that the federal government did not really take action, what did that mean for other individuals who weren't in states that provided special assistance and programs? And this is just what Cohen means when he says that social policies need to do a better job of kind of thinking about, what happens when people don't have families, when a lot of our social policies are somewhat predicated upon this idea that you have a family that is going to be your primary form of support and assistance. And everyone does not have a family. The third kind of focus theme in the chapter relates to social change. And so, Cohen notes that the future family is dependent on social changes, within larger society, and that certain trends are going to impact families for the next several generations. And this chapter focuses on two specific trends. One, the trends related to aging and fertility, and then the trends related to what he calls modern identities. So, aging and fertility. For those of you who maybe haven't taken a demography class, the demographic perspective focuses on how family processes impact the larger society. In particular, demography is interested in birth rates, death rates, and immigration. immigration rates, basically things that impact the population size, and population age structure. And, based on that data, there is the uh, demographic transition concept, which refers to the historical change from a society with low life expectancy and high birth rates to one with high life expectancy and low birth rates. For family studies, the biggest modern change occurred in the 19th and 20th centuries when most of the industrial world experienced the demographic transition. People started living longer because um, you know, they got less sick. And, the diseases that people got were diseases that could be treated, diseases that we refer to as chronic as opposed to acute diseases. And as people lived longer, and particularly as infant mortality rates decline, people started having less children. And so your textbook talks about this. They talk about how mortality rates started to decline because of improved sanitation, improved medical practices. Child mortality, particularly declined. So people were having less children. Not to mention, of course, as people shifted from an agrarian society in rural areas to a more industrial, post-industrial society in more suburban, urban areas. It just made sense to have less children. And so the smaller number of children in each family just contributed to smaller population growth overall. And although some of this was offset by the rates of immigration, all of it, of course, is not. And so these demographic shifts created a long-term change in the age structure of the population. Age structure speaks to the relative number of people of each age in a population. And your textbook goes over this, but basically the most common way of visualizing the age structure is with a population pyramid. When there is a high birth rate and a high mortality rate, meaning people don't live very long, they don't live to old age, the resulting figure does resemble a kind of, a common, pyramid shape, bigger at the bottom, small at the top. When there is a lower birth rate and a lower mortality rate, the figure looks more like a column, or, a pillar. So you can kind of see that, that is what America, our age structure has moved towards. In particular, the number of people who are, what your textbook calls the oldest old. I don't know. That seems like a kind of pejorative term, but that's how Cohen, how he phrases it there. They have increased. They have increased by 10 times, from 0.2% of the population to 2% of the population, which brings us to that trend to watch, which is the limits of longevity. So a lot of this, of course, is due to medical and technological advances. But basically, there is just an increased change in the number of people who we could identify as being the oldest old. And so more of them are going to continue to live to be 100. And so that means is that we've also seen an increase in the group of people that we call centenarians, people who are 100 years or older. But we've also even had to create the term super centenarians to account for the number of people who are now living to be even older than 110. And so, as the textbook notes, a lot of this survival, or what they call the survival ceiling, is dependent on medical breakthroughs that slow down aging or prevent diseases of old age. And for people who are interested in this, it also seems to be, obviously some health behaviors as well as just genetics involved. And so your third possible article is about centenarians, and it actually comes from a website. It's the New England Centenarian Study, and it's basically talking about, why should we study centenarians? What can we learn from centenarians, and what factors seem to contribute to advanced longevity? And how do you think this population shift is going to impact individual families as well as society as a whole? And so, and it is that impact on society as a whole, that Cohen kind of addresses here, when talking about aging and fertility. So he notes that there are some possible economic challenges if we continue to structure our economy according to the pre-transition conditions. Um, the first is that with fewer children, society invests more in each child, just as families with fewer children do. And the second consequence is, of course, like I said, that increasing number of elderly people. And so this is going to change how we view, work and retirement. For example, what age should individuals leave the workforce? The federal government has had to raise the age at which people are eligible to receive their full Social Security benefits because people are living longer. At the time, the original Social Security program was set up, people weren't living as long. Now, of course, there is the very real possibility, that if you start getting your Social Security at 65, and you've been working since you're 25, it's like, okay, yes, you worked, 40 years, but you could easily live to be, or maybe not easily, but you certainly could live to be like 112. And now at that point, you're now drawing Social Security for longer than you even necessarily worked. And these are the types of political considerations that people have to consider, and make. And of course, this isn't necessarily always very popular topics of conversation. Um, uh, and certainly politicians have been hesitant to really address them, largely because the elderly are such a consistent voting bloc. Um, and other kinds of trends that have emerged, which have allowed the society to somewhat accommodate the demographic transition, is the fact that people are starting to live longer, healthier lives. So the fact that we're having less children, it does mean though that people are staying in the workforce longer. They're not necessarily retiring like right at 65. Um, and because of that, the fact that there aren't necessarily as many young people entering into the labor force, some of that is potentially offset. And of course the rising labor force participation of women. So once again, even though we don't have as many young people, young men in particular, as we did in previous societies, in terms of the percentage or proportion of the labor force, the fact that we now have people working that would not necessarily have been working 50, 60, 70 years ago, is one way in which society has seemed to somewhat accommodate this demographic shift. All right. And so, your text has some graphs that kind of discuss that, or that kind of emphasize that. Obviously, the number of people who are not in the labor force, versus the number who are. You can kind of see that the number of people who are in the labor force, even as they get older, has increased among most groups. The other social change, trend that Cohen discusses, in a little less detail than the first, is modern identities. And he relates this to modernity theory, which emphasizes the importance, the significance of the individual as an actor in society. Um, and so, what this social change is focused on is that, you know, um, modern individuality has allowed for freely acting, individuals to choose their own family members, as opposed to tradition, or as opposed to other people in your family. Think about before, with like arranged marriages, or being forced to uphold or respect certain family bonds. And now, of course, with modernity theory, it has reshaped the way people think of themselves and their family lives. And so, your textbook kind of just discusses, there's diversity and among choices. And you can see this, of course, with both, who people choose to marry, and in the greater number of people that are, in fact, choosing partners that represent, as opposed to uh, uh, homogamous choices. Instead, they're heterogamous. They're marrying people that aren't like them. Of course, people make decisions to end marriages or to cohabit or to not marry at all, to have children or to not have children. And they oftentimes, evaluate and reflect upon these choices, largely based upon their own individual kind of needs and wants and desires. And although, we don't live in a perfectly tolerant society, one kind of key component of modernity theory is that, if you want to be free to make your own choices and to live your own life, then, to a certain extent, you also need to extend that freedom to others as well. And so, this raises that question of, um, yeah, are we reaching a live and let live type of society? Which brings me to the fourth theme from the chapter, responses to family change. Because for, everybody that's like a live and let live type of person, there are other people that are much more adamant that these changes are not necessarily, um, not necessarily desirable. And so your book notes that there is a wide response to family change. And responses can be, both formal and informal. You can have like organized political lobbying and campaigns, and you also can have more informal responses where you either just accept or criticize or try to shame people based on their family decisions. Cohen identifies three main attitudes towards social change, and I'm going to describe them in the next slide. He is the change is bad, which he kind of says is like a conservative type of perspective towards family change. Change is okay, which he describes as a liberal perspective, and change is good, which is a critical kind of perspective. Um, and then there's some people that he says that, basically say that there's no difference, right? It's not good, it's not bad. It just, there's no difference, it doesn't matter. And although he doesn't discuss them as a separate, as a specific type, for him, that's just indicative that some people are embracing the trend of live, let live, like they don't even have a strong opinion about it. But for people who do have an opinion, let's talk about those opinions. So change is bad. Um, this is the conservative kind of perspective where there is a singular ideal. There is an ideal family type, and that was a married heterosexual couple. This type of perspective promotes conformity instead of diversity. And a person who has this perspective is going to be opposed to a lot of the major trends of the last 50 years: same-sex marriage, interracial marriage, no-fault divorce, cohabitation, single motherhood, unwed parenthood. They believe that a lot of these changes represent the decline of the family because, of course, they view the family through that lens of there is an ideal type. There are two major branches to this line of thinking, and they represent the two motivations for opposing the family diversity model. Um, there is, the religious reasoning for prioritizing man and woman marriage, and uh, there's the belief that man woman marriage is just functionally, superior than alternative lifestyles, right? And so, there's not much to say about the religious reasoning. People have their religious beliefs, usually espoused by their religious leaders. The extent to which a secular democracy should really make policies based on religious reasonings of people in society. It kind of flies in the face of what we should expect in a secular democracy. So I'm not going to say a lot about that, besides the fact that for some people, their belief in this marriage ideal is just very strongly tied to their religious identity and religious beliefs. But for the people who it's less about religion and more just about what they feel like, what is functionally superior, um, obviously, these people, this is important to kind of consider. Why would they say that this family type is functionally superior? You know, are is there research that supports that? Do they have a point? And although your book notes that these groups are not mutually exclusive and often overlap, so frequently people can their reasoning reflects kind of both. Um, but for people who, regardless of their motivation, for people that have this conservative perspective, oftentimes they take the stance that policies and laws and regulations should encourage the heterosexual married couple arrangement, and maybe even penalize those who don't achieve it. Um, and, Cohen just notes that when we look at societies that have done this, they really haven't been that successful in curtailing diversity. And what they have been is just harmful because of the stigma that they promote, and the idea that some families are bad families, um, just because they don't meet that ideal. The next perspective is what um, Cohen describes as the liberal perspective, is tolerance of diversity. Um, Change is okay. Um, this perspective isn't against the traditional American family, but they are open to growing new family structures. And they really just prefer a hands off approach that doesn't really interfere with family decisions. They believe that policies should relax restrictions and regulations related to, family issues. So these could be things like, birth control, divorce, same-sex marriages, basically just, that the government should not really put, those types of restrictions in place. Um, and a lot of these policies are motivated by the belief in the equal treatment of everyone and extending equal rights to people in all families. Cohen makes the point that tolerance is not an endorsement, and it just kind of supports this live and let live ideal. For people who are critical of this perspective, largely the conservative perspective people, they just say that this is going to contribute to the decline of family, or at least the decline of that ideal family type. And then finally, the final perspective, which I guess is the most radical, is the perspective that Cohen describes as being critical. And this is a full-throated embrace of change. It is a more active attitude towards change than the liberal attitude. And it basically promotes the view that the traditional family should decline, right? It isn't just about supporting diversity and acceptance of other types. It is the active promotion that the traditional family is problematic and should decline. And for people that have this perspective, the evidence that they offer is, that the traditional family contributes to inequality, and hinders the acceptance of diversity. The traditional family involves power and unequal relationships between men and women and children that are problematic. The breakdown of the dominant family form, is necessary. Break down the family where the husband makes more money than the wife, and challenge the privileges afforded to heterosexual married couples at the expense of other family types. The policy agendas related to the critical perspective usually reflect a desire to emancipate people, especially women, from patriarchal power structures, welfare support for poor women, paid family leave, that, that exist, regardless of family structure. Um, these types of policies, which are sometimes called defamilialization policies, free people from family dependence and make family relationships more voluntary, right? This idea that you don't necessarily have to rely on your family, to have access to specific resources and support and recognition from the government. Another way of kind of thinking about these three family types, or another set of terms that I've seen used, are the acceptors, the rejectors, and the skeptics. People who accept, they're close to like the critical perspective. They have a full-throated acceptance and approval of the family changes. They think they're going to be good for society. The rejectors, of course, this kind of aligns with the conservative perspective. They reject the family changes that we are currently seeing. They think that it is going to be conclusively bad for society. And then, of course, you have the skeptics. This is, probably closest to the liberal perspective that Cohen describes, in the sense that they aren't sure about, the overall impact. It is probably going to be okay. They aren't necessarily providing, they definitely aren't fully promoting the traditional family as ideal, but nor are they necessarily denouncing the traditional family. And similarly, they are tolerating the changes in family, but they aren't, fully supportive or fully rejecting them. So related to this, acceptance or denial, and attitudes towards family change, I have selected an article that you can read from the Pew Research Center. It's entitled As Family Structures Change in the US, a growing share of Americans say it makes no difference. Um, and so, basically, you read this article, you'll see that they're making a lot of the same points that Cohen did. But, one thing to kind of consider, how does the author characterize the shifts in public opinion towards changes in family? And what do you think has contributed to those shifts? So we have this quote from the book. We have seen many instances in which families are the sites where inequality is experienced or produced. That includes inequality between spouses, between parents and children, and between families as well. Families also are sites of caring, cooperation, and resilience in the face of inequality. And as we think about addressing the challenges that inequality poses to us in the future, we need to consider how people and families respond or fail to respond in support of each other. So, how do families act in the face of inequality? And so, one thing the book focuses on is the increased number of people who are living in multi-generational households. And your book says that this can be explained through two common patterns. There are young adults living with their parents, and there are children living with their grandparents. For young adults living with their parents, obviously this reflects changes in the economic market and the ability to support one's own household due to these economic changes. For children who are living with their grandparents, there's been an increase in the younger children living with their grandparents. It's most common in lower income families where children's parents may be absent, or need extra help because of unemployment or health issues. And grandparents are often the last resort before the foster care system. And of course, the fact that, there is the availability of these grandparents, relates back to the trend that we just discussed in regards to longevity and the increased number of people living longer and healthier lives. So, families will respond to, or have the ability to respond to changes. And your book says how American society will respond to ongoing changes in family structure and relationships remains to be seen. Conflicting cultural attitudes toward family diversity, changing laws, and political debates, and even new technologies will all affect how new family forms emerge and develop. And that is how Cohen ends his textbook. That's, how we're going to be ending our course. Families do change. And, what is going to be the result of those changes and what's going to be those consequences of those changes, of course, has a lot to do with how people and how other social institutions respond to those change. And that is what we are currently seeing and what we are currently experiencing.